Hitler arrived in power on January 30th, 1933. On February 3rd, he made his warmongering intentions clear to the military chief of staff. Our aim is to defy the Treaty of Versailles, to destroy the international monetary system, and to expand in Eastern Europe. Hitler wanted to go to war. Ever since he'd written Mein Kampf in prison in 1925, he was totally obsessed by war. War waged by the strong against the weak, by the supposed Aryans against the Jews. War wasn't just an option, it was the sole reason for the Nazis' existence.
Eigentlich grausam. Da zwingt man diese starken Tiere zum Kampf auf Leben und Tod. Und in ihrem Walde hätten beide so ruhig weiterleben können.
Aber liebes Fräulein Volkmann, ein ruhiges Leben ist doch nirgends in der Natur zu finden.
Aber Herr Professor, es fressen sich doch nicht alle gegenseitig auf.
Wenn auch das nicht gerade, aber sie leben alle in einem ständigen Kampf. Dabei wird das Schwache vernichtet.
To go to war, you need an army. In 1933, Germany didn't have one. The Treaty of Versailles had put a limit on Germany's ground forces to 100,000 men. It had forbidden the country to have an air force or a navy. The military apparatus was very basic, and the Reichswehr was forced to use pretend tanks made out of wood and canvas in order to train. One of Hitler's first decisions was to rebuild the army, and that needed money. Germany had been ruined by years of crises and was broke.
1930s Germany had a standard of living comparable perhaps to South Africa or Iran today. So a lower middle income country where you would expect to see a combination of cars and motorways perhaps and modern industry on the one hand, and then peasants pulling wooden wheel carts with horses on the other. It was poor in the sense that it was suffering from the effects of the Great Depression, which were worse in Germany than anywhere else in the world except possibly the United States. It was a comprehensive crisis of the German economy. Agriculture, banking, industry were all suffering. 6 million people were unemployed.
It was heavily indebted to the outside world, particularly to the United States, debts that they couldn't repay, obliged to pay reparations to the Allies, which they couldn't any longer pay. Foreign currency and gold had almost disappeared. 40% of the workforce was unemployed. Much of the rest of the workforce was on short time. Trade had collapsed, more than halved between 1929 and 1933. Industrial production was down to the levels of the 1890s.
It was a country that had been bled dry, which the Nazis dreamed of setting back onto the path of war. In order to make war, steel was needed. Steel required iron ore and coal. Rearmament depended also on petrol, rubber, and chemicals. A workforce was needed, as were engineers, technicians, and researchers to design and make arms. German industries had all this know-how, but where was the money going to come from? Money was the crucial issue. Since the Nazis had none, they invented it. A little-known but providential man was in charge of this magic trick. The Minister of the Economy and President of the Reichsbank, the German central bank, Hjalmar Schacht. He invented the MIFO bills.
So at the time, Hjalmar Schacht was often discussed as the wizard of German finance, the man who could kind of create money out of thin air. And he'd first earned this reputation in fighting the hyperinflation of the 1920s.
But in 1934, Schacht says, OK, if you want to rearm, we have to find a special device for doing it. Because rearming was still illegal under the Versailles Treaty. They were not supposed to rearm. So Schacht had the idea that you would supply these bills from a basically fake company. The so-called MIFO bills came from a fake company, which was basically a mask so that the outside world could not see what was going on. And those bills were actually given to companies that began to produce weapons as a kind of currency, which could then be cashed at a later date when the government was able to pay them back.
The MIFO bills were created by Schacht. The MIFO was a dummy company who had a capital of 1 million Reichsmarks, provided by Krupp, Siemens, and other big names of the German metal and steel industries. Nothing was produced by the MIFO, no employees were taken on, and no factories were opened. The only thing the MIFO did produce were debts, which would help to finance the major part of the German expenditure on rearmament from 1934. In practical terms, any firm contracted by the Nazi regime to provide goods required for rearmament was not paid in Reichsmarks, the official currency, but in bills of exchange issued by the MIFO. The bills were guaranteed by the state. They were trusted and used as currency between arms manufacturers in order to finance their production. The MIFO bills became a parallel currency reserved only for the rearmament sector.
It was a very clever device because it, first of all, restored confidence. Secondly, it veiled rearmament from the outside world so they couldn't see what was going on. And it meant that the government didn't have to pay for this until some years later. It avoided the risk of currency inflation. It avoided the problems that Germany had faced in the years after the First World War.
But because Hjalmar Schacht at the Reichsbank promises to exchange its debts for cash at a tiny discount, effectively is issuing the equivalent of cash. And that, of course, is a very effective way of providing the armament industry with the liquidity, with the cash that it needs to start the process of production again in 1933 and then onwards from there.
Schacht's conjuring trick worked like a charm. In 1934, out of the 4 billion Reichsmarks invested in rearmament, less than half was entered into the Reich's official budget. It was the beginning of an incredible upturn. Rearmament kick-started the economy and freed the Germans from a long period of crises and self-doubt. Metal and steelwork industries were the big beneficiaries. Krupp's order books were full. Tyson's blast furnaces were at full capacity. IG Farben started working on a new synthetic fuel. Engineers at Porsche, Mercedes, and BMW invented new engines to drive the tanks built by Krupp, the planes that would be built by Messerschmitt, and the ships and submarines built by Blom and Voss.
We would probably assume, I think, that German industrialists were very happy with rearmament. It suddenly meant there were orders coming in, they could start re-employing people again. This might be a rearmament boom. But actually many industrialists in Germany were very cautious about this. They didn't want to do anything that upset the Allies or which put Germany at risk. So there was some hesitation in the early years from German industrialists.
Hitler was not actually the puppet of the big German industrialists. Krupp, Thyssen, IG Farben, the great industrial families, belonged to a different world than that of the Nazi dignitaries. Even though Gustav Krupp, huge steel and cannon maker, distributed copies of Mein Kampf to the deserving workers in his Essen factories, he nevertheless remained wary of the Nazi Party, whose full name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The industrialists were distrustful of the regime's social dimension. But they were soon reassured that Hitler wasn't a pinko. Rearmament guaranteed growth, and the MIFOs piled up in the coffers. Dachau and Oranienburg were the first camps to open on March 20th, 1933. And the first political prisoners were locked up there the following day. For the leading German industrialists, the arrival in power of the Nazis was a safeguard against the communist threat.
It's fair to say that indoctrination started in 1933-34. The strongest measure was the outlawing of trade unions in May 1933. Then specifically in factories, the Führer principle was introduced. The leadership principle was one of command by and obedience to the boss, with a very clear sense of hierarchy within the factories. This meant that the employer's authority took precedence over the corporate councils, which had been one of the social advances of the Weimar Republic.
The Nazi order prevailed. Strikes were made illegal, salaries were frozen, and trade unions banned. They were replaced by the German Labor Front, a single organization encompassing all workers. Big businesses' wishes had come true.
Meine Herren Statthalter, Gauleiter und Parteigenossen und meine deutschen Arbeiter. Im Verkehr beginnen wir nunmehr neue Schlagadern zu bauen. Ein neues Verkehrsmittel wird nun in der Gestaltung des deutschen Straßenwesens die ihm gebührende und notwendige Berücksichtigung finden. Und ehe 6 Jahre vergangen, soll ein Riesenberg zeugen von unserem Willen, unserem Fleiß, unserer Fähigkeit und unserer Entschlusskraft. Deutsche Arbeiter, an das Werk!
This was the propaganda. In Germany, motorways, bridges, and housing are being built by pick and shovel. Away from the munitions factories, which ensured a huge majority of jobs, the Führer took the unemployed off the streets and gave them work on building sites and motorways. This was the Nazis' economic miracle. They led people to believe that a society of leisure and consumerism based on the American model was possible. The regime was social. It built houses for the German families and cruise ships for their holidays. Goods manufactured for the people were given priority. The People's Radio was mass-produced, as was the famous people's car, the Volkswagen.
The economic miracle of the Nazi regime is an attractive idea, obviously, for the regime itself. And in fact, it has admirers around the world. There is a real sense in which contemporaries feel that they have found ways to control, master the economy, and make the economy subject to human will and politics. But the element of it, which is deceptive, if you like, is the balance and the costs and the benefits. Right? Is this a miracle in the sense that it's a completely free lunch? And it is not a completely free lunch in the case of Nazi Germany any more than it is in the case of the New Deal or the Soviet Union, because in the process of economic growth, more economic activity is created. People are, on the whole, on average, definitely better off by 1938 than they were in 1932. But the balance of the economy has shifted dramatically towards the armament sector. It is the largest single shift in economic resource, economic production by any non-socialist state in peacetime in the historical record. Defense goes from essentially 1% to 0% of German GDP to 20% by 1938 in the space of 5 years.
Two million unemployed went back to work. 5 years after Hitler's accession to power, full employment was achieved. But prosperity was not widespread. In 1934, a working-class household spent around 50% of its budget on food, drink, and tobacco. Wages were cut back. But it didn't seem to matter. German workers had newfound hope. They were encouraged to scrimp and save so that one day they could afford a people's car. An illusion. No German started driving a VW until the 1950s.
It's common in thinking about the Nazi regime to juxtapose guns and butter. And the idea is, if you like, that the German population did without consumption because the political priorities of the regime dictated rearmament. This is true from the point of view of economic statistics. What it doesn't capture is the extent to which the German population at large, in fact, gained, if you like, psychic satisfaction from the process of rearmament.
The real people's product was in fact the army. On March 16, 1935, Hitler reintroduced military service. Rearmament became official and was in plain view.
So there are few things that the Nazi regime did over its entire history that were more popular than the reintroduction of conscription in 1935. There is a huge sense that Nazi Germany is restoring to the German nation, to the German public, something which they have been deprived of since World War I, since the onerous terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty. The pleasure, the very genuine pleasure in seeing the nation in arms, seeing your young men being drilled into real soldiers, into real men, in other words. Now, this costs money, sure, but it's, price well worth paying for this collective pleasure. To put it very concretely, when you're drafted into the army, they might train you to drive. They're going to give you a fancy new machine gun to practice with. They're going to show you how the radio works, and you will go on maneuvers, and there will be dive bombers flying overhead. It's a high-tech experience that you cannot have in provincial Germany in the 1920s. The militarization is a process of modernization of a collective kind.
War started to enter public consciousness. Rearmament parades became popular. Huge parties were organized every year, and mock battles were put on. The Army's assault tanks and fighter bombers were on display for all to see. Nazism reorganized the whole economy and all of society around its vision of war. War became mass entertainment. In 1936, the new Reich's army, the Wehrmacht, reoccupied the Rhineland, a major industrial steel working area, which had been demilitarized since the Treaty of Versailles. To continue the march towards war, industry needed more and more raw materials. Germany had little or none. They had to buy them from abroad and pay in gold or in currency such as dollars, francs, or pounds, none of which Germany had either. Schacht started to worry. The MIFOs had certainly helped kickstart the economy, but now they had to be paid back. Continuing at this pace was impossible. This overheated economy needed to be slowed down, which meant holding back rearmament and gradually paying back the MIFO debts. This is what he told Hitler.
And Schacht says, you can't sustain rearmament much beyond this level. I'm happy with what we've achieved so far, but if you rearm more heavily, it's going to create all kinds of problems for the German economy.
Violent argument breaks out within the Nazi regime between Schacht on the one hand, who advocates nationalism and the rebuilding of German strength and a politics of power towards Germany's neighbours, but is concerned about the balance of the German economy and is not interested in a full-on confrontation with the major powers of the world, which are Britain and France still at this moment. And the figures notably around Goering, who basically want to push rearmament to the maximum extent.
So Hitler thinks about this, and he decides that he's going to shift control over the economy away from Schacht and the experts to somebody in the party. Who does he choose? He chooses the most unlikely person. He chooses Hermann Goering.
Goering, a Nazi from the early days and senior official of the regime, was put in charge of the German economy in order to force through continued rearmament. The MIFO bills could wait.
And so he makes Goering head of the second four-year plan. The first four-year plan was a four-year plan for re-employment after 33. The second four-year plan begins in October 36, and it transforms the German economy. Goering assumes responsibility over trade, foreign currency, price control, investment, and under Goering's direction, a major program of so-called self-sufficiency is undertaken.
Es werden in den nächsten Zeiten selbstverständlich neue Fabriken entstehen. Fabriken, in denen wir den eigenen Gummi machen. Fabriken, in denen wir aus Zellstoff, Faserstoffe eigene Kleider schaffen. In denen wir die Baumwolle dann nicht mehr brauchen, die uns heute Millionen von Devisen kostet.
Germany only had its own strength to rely on. Goering brought in a policy of economic autonomy, beginning by creating factories in his name. The Hermann Goering Works were founded in 1937 to enable the mining and transformation of Salzgitter's poor quality and unprofitable iron ore. Autarky also enabled the development program for synthetic rubber called Buna, made by the giant firm IG Farben, whose profits soared by 90%. Germany needed to become free from all its petrol imports as quickly as possible. Enormous public investment sped up the program of the production of synthetic fuel. But autarky had its price. 1 ton of steel from Goering's factories was 3 times more expensive than 1 ton of imported steel from Romania or the Soviet Union. The difference was paid by the state, who handed out staggering subsidies. Nothing was spared for autonomy. From a strictly economic point of view, autarky was not a rational decision. The Nazi economy closed in on itself in order to prepare for war. On the economic level, war had already been declared.
They're not unrealistic enough to imagine that Germany can ever really be self-sufficient. The aim of the game is to harden Germany for the war that is to come, is to make it more resilient than it had been in World War I. This is, of course, at the same time that the Nazi regime escalates foreign policy tension. There is the Anschluss with Austria early in 1938, and then the very deliberate push to dismember Czechoslovakia by way of Sudetenland. And this raises the international tension in a way that the regime was not really prepared for.
With the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in March 1938, and then with the pogrom of Kristallnacht in the same year, the outlines of a specifically Nazi economy were drawn, an economy which incorporated systematic anti-Semitism into the regime.
The vision of the enemy is not the big industrialist, the cigar-smoking steel baron. The vision of the enemy for the Nazis is quite specifically money capital. It is the banker, it is the financier. And of course, that figure is indelibly associated all the way back to the Middle Ages in European anti-Semitism with the Jew. And so Nazi anti-Semitism is directly linked to an economic ideology which is hostile to commerce, which is hostile to finance, which is hostile to money, which regards these things as footloose, as indeterminate, as not rooted in the soil of the nation, as belonging to a race which is the sworn historic, transhistoric enemy of the German race.
Sie vergewaltigten auch die deutsche Kultur, zersetzten die Literatur, vergifteten den Geist der deutschen Wirtschaft, schufen das Glücksrittertum in der Industrie, beuteten den Bauer und Arbeiter aus und würdigten den deutschen Handel herab.
Jews were often considered as parasites belonging to the golden clique of global financial capitalism, symbolized by gold and money. On the other hand, there was the world of blood and soil, of loyalty and honor associated with Germany.
In the National Socialist vision, money and race were incompatible because monetary exchange implied mediation and trade between people. The Nazis were hostile to money, and yet needed it to finance their economy. In this new economic paradigm, which the Nazis were trying to put in place, Aryans were not supposed to buy, they could just take. They shouldn't pay, they should steal, and steal principally from the Jewish population.
The plundering of the Jews and the violence against Jews went hand in hand. It happened in Austria from March 1938. It happened with the pogrom in Germany, sometimes called the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9, 1938. Firstly, their belongings were confiscated. Secondly, communities were attacked, both synagogues and individuals. It created an atmosphere which was supposed to provoke Jews to leave the country, and on a more practical level, it brought in a great deal of wealth, of money, to the Reich. In the summer of 1938, an office was set up in Vienna specifically to deal with the emigration of Jews. This office was set up by Eichmann. Its aim was to tax the Jews heavily on their departure, to force them to pay this tax and leave behind all their possessions in Austria. The same setup was copied in Berlin in January 1939. So it was clear from the outset that spoliation was linked to a mechanism of exclusion.
In order to pay for the damage of Kristallnacht, the Nazis imposed huge fines on the Jewish community. The shop windows had to be replaced, urgently requiring imported glass from Belgium, which would cost the Reichsbank 3 million marks in precious foreign currency. Goering was furious. Even senior Nazi officials were obliged to follow the rules of market forces for just a while longer. Despite the money stolen from the Jews, the annexation of the Austrian steel mines and factories, the requisition of Czech tanks, and despite the intense mobilization of German factories, the Führer still didn't have the army which he needed to conquer Europe. The Wehrmacht, which paraded for Hitler's 50th birthday in Berlin in 1939, was only partially motorized. The army mostly paraded on horseback and on bicycles. Krupp's armored vehicles were on parade, but still technically inferior to French tanks. The Navy only had 5 battleships, and the Air Force didn't have a single heavy bomber.
The question of whether Germany was ready for war in 1939 has haunted all debate since then, because it bears on the question of how we think the war started. Those who believe that Germany was ready have a intentionalist view, if you like. They view the war as the product of Hitler's decision-making in a straightforward and linear fashion. Those who think the German economy was not ready for war in 1939 tend to think of it, as it were, the war resulting from a miscalculation. My own view is that the realization on Germany's part that the German economy was not ready for war produced, perversely, a decision to go to war. Hitler is often accused of not having a very good grip of the economics, not following the details. I don't think this does him any justice. He understands what they are, and he just concludes that from a grand strategic point of view, if you are committed to war, if you know there must be war, and you know there must be war because your broader ideology tells you if you don't wage war, the Jews will wage war on you some other way. In other words, you must move to the open phase of war if Germany is to have any hope at all of surviving, the German race of surviving. Then now is a better moment than 2 or 3 years from now, even if the tidy military bureaucrats would rather have their projects finished by then.
Hitler told his military chiefs, "We've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Thanks to the restrictions, our economic situation is such that we cannot hold out. Goering will tell you we have to act." To everyone's surprise, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The German-Soviet Pact was signed on August 23, 1939.
The most important decision by Germany is, of course, the alliance with the Soviet Union, the Hitler-Stalin Pact of the fall of 1939, which cements the Soviet Union both as a strategic partner in the destruction of Poland, but also as a fundamental source of key economic supplies for the German war effort, crucially oil, some grain as well, key iron ore, metal ores for steel production. So this secures, if you like, the hinterland of the German war effort.
On September 1st, 1939, German troops invaded Poland. Victory was quickly and resoundingly won, but munitions were in short supply, and a quarter of the assault tanks were decommissioned. This put a damper on things, for despite the massive rearmament program that had been forcibly imposed since 1933, the economy was still not responding. The invasion of Poland drew France and the United Kingdom into the conflict. The phony war began. French and German troops observed each other from behind their casemates on the Maginot and Siegfried lines. This respite enabled the Nazi war economy to carry out a thorough reorganization.
One of the things that became clear as soon as the war had broken out was that nobody was really controlling the war economy. Hitler decided that the time had come to appoint a minister responsible for the production of munitions and weapons. And he appointed Fritz Todt, Nazi party engineer, who had been the man responsible for building the motorways in the 1930s, building the fortifications in 1938, 39, 40, and so on. A man that Hitler trusted. And he was made Minister of Munitions, and the idea was that he would now supervise what was going on to make sure that some kind of order could be brought into the war economy. The military didn't like being bossed around by a civilian. And the problem was that aircraft production was not under his control. He had no control over labor. He couldn't control prices. He couldn't control the allocation of raw materials. So that he was operating all the time against other parts of the economy that had their own interests to pursue. Goering, for example, wanted to carry on with the big investment programs in raw material production, etc., even though those resources were needed to produce armaments.
Hitler made some drastic choices. He sacrificed the Navy, maintained the tank building programs, but made munitions and the Air Force his two main priorities. The Luftwaffe was allocated 40% of military expenditure. And above all, the production of arms, shells, and ordnance was multiplied by 8. The armaments minister, Todt, managed to focus the war industry on specific and short-term achievable aims. The only thing that counted was immediate war and nothing but war. The goal was achieved. Between January and July 1940, arms production doubled, the most spectacular increase during the whole war. In May 1940, Denmark and Norway were invaded, followed by Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France, all within the space of a few weeks. A feeling of euphoria broke out in the Reich. In the propaganda films, against a typical backdrop of Stukas and invincible panzers, the regime celebrated the triumph of mind over matter. Germany, a poor country, trapped within a territory that was too small, had found its soul again. Thanks to Nazism, the nation was able to surpass itself and surmount the lack of money and shortages of raw materials. The Nazi economy succeeded in freeing itself from material considerations. In reality, the German people were hungry, the tanks needed fuel, and so the war economy claimed what it was owed. The National Socialist regime was waging the war on credit hidden by the MIFO bills, which the regime began to pay back by printing money, and credit based on the collateral of goods plundered and pillaged in the occupied countries. The Nazi economy had to feed off war. Military equipment, raw materials, supplies of petrol, tin, copper, nickel, locomotives, and cannons were systematically confiscated and stockpiled in a huge wartime booty.
One way of doing it, of course, was also to take money from the occupied areas. France, for example, had to supply Germany with a very large quantity of money to fund the German war effort. Same was true of other parts of Europe, but France was the richest part of occupied Europe. In the end, about a third of the expenses of the German war effort were met by finances taken from the occupied area.
Silver, gold, coal from Poland, cereals from France. The Nazis stole from all over Europe. Its economy needed this spoliation in order to function. German soldiers had to steal for food. Corruption became commonplace, and everyone helped themselves where they could.
Before 1933 in particular, Nazi propaganda constantly repeated that militant National Socialists were all victims of the system, victims of democracy, and victims of the Jews. So after 1933, when the Nazis attained political power, not only did they have no moral inhibitions, but they weren't even conscious of acting illegally, when they got rich at the expense of the victims, for example. Many of them thought that it was perfectly normal, and that it was what they were entitled to. The particular entitlement of the strongest implies that they didn't feel obliged to take into consideration the rights of the weakest. And by definition, this ideology encouraged corruption. When victims are denied their human rights and their ownership rights, then it is totally justified, so to speak, from an ideological point of view, to dispossess the victim. Hitler and Goering were particularly adept at corruption. They were by far the greatest art thieves in history. Hermann Goering alone stole more than 1,375 paintings, 250 sculptures, and 168 tapestries, whose present-day value has been estimated at several billion euros. To put it another way, there was an outrageous conflation between the economy, the state, the party, and the private sphere, which were clearly inseparable from one another.
Germany was short of everything: food, raw materials, money, and military equipment. In the defeated and occupied countries, there was organized pillage. Stealing became legal and commonplace. In mixing improvisation and theft, the German war economy was a huge shambles.